Special counsel Jack Smith finally indicted President Trump over January 6th. We've been predicting that this would happen for a long time. We've known that this was coming. Every prosecution of a January 6th defendant was building towards indicting President Trump for nothing. He didn't do anything wrong on January 6th. You can agree or disagree with his take on what happened during the 2020 presidential election and the campaigns beforehand and the electioneering and all of that. But every single thing the Department of Justice has done in depriving the right of due process to the defendants on January 6th, in overcharging people, in sentencing, yes, unsavory characters like Stuart Rhodes to 18 years in prison because of a text message the guy sent. All of this has been leading directly to Jack Smith, the special counsel appointed by Merrick Garland, indicting Trump. And finally, that happened. Last night, the special counsel filed under seal an indictment with the judge. This is by far the worst part of this indictment. Let me read this to you. So the charges, by the way, that President Trump is facing in this new indictment, I'm going to read you that first before I read you. The charges are conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. Now, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding sounds insignificant, but the legal precedent that the Department of Justice has set when they've been prosecuting January 6th defendants for obstruction of an official proceeding, this is usually their justification for pretrial detention. All of the January 6th defendants that were held for years before their trial, it was because they were deemed a threat to our government's processes because they were charged with obstruction of an official proceeding. So this is what the indictment reads. It's chilling. The defendant, Donald Trump, had a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to claim falsely that there had been outcome determinative fraud during the election and that he had won. So let me just pause there for a second. So Jack Smith in this indictment is saying that President Trump had a right to free speech and that he had a right to his own opinion. He had a right to believe that there was fraud, even fraud that rose to the level of altering the outcome of the election. And he had a right to speak this publicly. This is where it gets really, really chilling. The indictment says he was also entitled to formally challenge the results of the election through lawful and appropriate means, such as by seeking recounts or audits of the popular vote in states or filing lawsuits challenging ballots and procedures. Indeed, in many cases, the defendant did pursue these methods of contesting the election results. His efforts to change the outcome in any state through recounts, audits, or legal challenges, or his efforts were uniformly unsuccessful. The indictment then says, shortly after Election Day, the defendant also pursued unlawful means of discounting legitimate votes and subverting the election results. In doing so, the defendant perpetuated 3 criminal conspiracies: a conspiracy to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government; a conspiracy to corruptly obstruct and impede the January 6th congressional proceeding at which the collected results of the presidential election are counted and certified; a conspiracy against the right to vote and to have one's vote counted. Each of these conspiracies, and we're going to go through them in a second. I just want to read this to you first. Each of these conspiracies, which built on the widespread mistrust the defendant was creating through pervasive and destabilizing lies about election fraud, targeted a bedrock function of the United States federal government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. So how do you reconcile these two things? The beginning of what I just read you says, Jack Smith, the special counsel appointed by Merrick Garland, says the defendant has a right to say whatever he wants, to believe that the election was stolen, and to publicly say that the election was stolen. And then you go down to the bottom and you realize that Jack Smith doesn't believe that. The Department of Justice doesn't believe that. They are indicting President Trump because they believe that President Trump's opinions about, or conclusions, whatever you want to term this, it doesn't matter. It could be his opinion, and you may believe his opinion is wrong. It could be the results of his analysis. It could be the conclusion that he drew from the evidence that was laid in front of him. It doesn't matter. For the purposes of this indictment, at least, it doesn't matter. But they are saying because they do not agree with his conclusions that it constitutes obstruction of an official government proceeding. So his words saying that you should peacefully and patriotically march down to the Capitol, that constitutes obstruction of an official proceeding because he pressured Vice President Mike Pence to send batches of electors back to their states because he didn't think that those states' elections had been done according to state law, that constitutes obstruction of an official proceeding? I don't think so. What that is, and let's be very clear, that is criminalization of free speech. That is the prohibition on a political opinion that the Department of Justice, run by leftists, disagree with. It is the weaponization of the federal government against the sitting president of the United States' chief political opponent. It's banana republic stuff. Now, President Trump knew that this indictment was coming shortly before the prosecutor had filed this indictment in front of the judge. President Trump posted on Truth Social and said, "I hear that deranged Jack Smith, in order to interfere with the presidential election of 2024, will be putting out yet another fake indictment of your favorite president at 5 p.m. It happened a little bit after 5 p.m., but President Trump was mostly correct. Why didn't they do this 2.5 years ago? Why did they wait so long? Because they wanted to put it right in the middle of my campaign, prosecutorial misconduct." He's exactly right. This isn't really about the 2020 presidential election. It's about the 2024 presidential election. It's about Joe Biden corruptly abusing his power, using the federal government to target his chief political opponent. I mean, this is something you would expect to happen in in the Soviet Union, in communist China. Conspiracy to defraud the United States? What does that mean? Conspiracy to defraud the United States because you believe, not just believe, because there's evidence that states changed laws when they didn't have the authority to change the laws, which means that some votes, while the voters themselves may have been valid voters, the time and the place in which they cast the vote wasn't valid, and yet those invalidly cast votes were counted as valid votes in violation of state law. Observing that and calling that out, demanding accountability, observing the empirical evidence that impacted the outcome of the entire election, not just individual state ballot counts, that's a conspiracy to defraud the United States. It's funny because in Saul Linsky's book, Rules for Radicals, he explains that one of the tactics that leftists should use is accusing other people of what you are doing yourself, accusing the other side of the crimes that you are committing, because it's really hard if you're saying, if Jack Smith is saying, Trump, you defrauded the United States, for Trump to be like, you defrauded the United States. Even though that is, of course, what happened during the 2020 election. The Democrats defrauded the voters of the United States. This is classic Saul Linsky tactics. Joe Biden is using the Department of Justice. So conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. How can you obstruct an official proceeding with words? How come all of these protesters that broke into all of these state capitals, picture Nashville. After the Covenant school shooting in Nashville, the left tried to use this to push gun control, and you had these elected representatives in the Nashville State House blocking the legislative procedure. They had to adjourn the House, and yet they weren't charged with obstruction of an official procedure, even though that's what they did. What about the Kavanaugh protesters who tried to bang down the doors of the Supreme Court? Were they charged with obstruction of an official proceeding? They were not. And yet Trump, who didn't even do that, all he did was try to convince Mike Pence that a legal theory that Mike Pence disagreed with was a valid legal theory. And President Trump told the people at his rally outside the White House on January 6th to go down and let their legislatures know through peaceful protest that they were unhappy with what the Congress was doing, unhappy with the outcome of the election because the outcome was based on fishy practices. That's obstruction of an official proceeding? No. What we are witnessing right now in the United States of America is the criminalization of free speech. And make no mistake, if the Department of Justice and Biden and the Democrats are willing to so abuse their power to criminalize the free speech of the former president, who is running for president again, who is the chief political rival of Joe Biden, it's not just going to be Trump.